the direction of Bob Schofield. Welcome, please, the Oroville Community Concert Band. Well, good evening and welcome to our annual spring concert. The first number you just heard was called A New Day by composer Phil Jackson. We tried to find out more about Mr. Jackson, but unfortunately, every time we searched for him, all the results were for the former professional basketball coach of the same name. The piece itself, however, does a good job of expressing the hope we all feel at the beginning of a new day or perhaps a new adventure. It was also one of the more challenging pieces that the band has ever attempted as they continue to grow as a group. You might have noticed in your program that our theme this evening represents the fact that several of our pieces were either composed or arranged by local musicians and composers, including some in the band tonight. Later this evening, we're also proud to present a world premiere of a piece written specifically for the Oroville Community Concert Band. In the meantime, this next number was written by world-famous composer John Williams. 41 years ago, Williams was already hugely known to audiences in America and around the world. By 1984, he had already composed dozens of film scores, including Jaws, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Superman, Star Wars, E.T., and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Williams was asked to compose a piece that would be used for the TV coverage and in concerts preceding the 1985 Olympics in Los Angeles. The piece also contained a fanfare that would be played live by herald trumpets at each of the medal ceremonies. He had to compete with the well-known Bugler's Dream, which ABC used as a theme music for their coverage of the previous 4 Olympics. So the pressure for Williams was on. On June 12, 1984, John Williams conducted the famous Boston Pops Orchestra at Symphony Hall in Boston. He chose that venue for the world premiere of our next selection. The music the audience heard that night was unmistakably Williams, a theme fit for superhuman athletes. This piece was arranged by Mike Sarringar, a local trombone player who, although not here tonight, often sits in with the band. Here is Olympic Fanfare and Theme. next number, Meditation, is a symphonic intermezzo from an opera by French composer Jules Massenet. The piece is written for solo violin, orchestra, and backstage chorus. The opera premiered in Paris in March of 1894. Meditation is the most well-known of his works. The Oroville Community Concert Band is excited to be joined tonight by local violinist Forrest Wong. Forrest grew up in Oroville and started playing violin at the age of 5. Some of her favorite memories of playing violin while growing up revolved around playing with friends in the Chico Music Teachers Association of California Youth Orchestra. At the age of 16, she and her brother Hunter Wong co-founded the In Tune Music Foundation. The In Tune Music Foundation is nonprofit and dedicated to promoting music education and community in Butte County. Part of In Tune Music involves organizing the annual Dream Big Music Festival, which was held last month here at the Oroville State Theater. It's a music concert series that raises money for bands throughout the Oroville school districts. Today, Forrest enjoys playing violin more casually and while turning her creative pursuits to visual art forms such as painting and drawing. Ladies and gentlemen, Meditation by Jules Massenet, featuring Forrest Wong on violin. one more round of applause for Our next number this evening is a special piece with a story behind it. Stephen, a clarinet player, right here, began playing with the Oroville Community Concert Band after graduating from high school in 1996. That doesn't seem like 29 years ago, does it? Though he has played with the group off and on over the years, he's been a dedicated member since 2015. 3 years ago, Stephen composed this piece that you're about to hear as part of a personal project, Project 231. Earlier this year, he asked his daughter, Eliana Gifford, to select and arrange a composition from his library, and she chose this one, giving it the title Sunburst. The name reflects the imagery of sunlight bursting through clouds, symbolizing hope, warmth, and renewal. This collaboration between father and daughter is a beautiful testament to the power of music and family. Please enjoy Sunburst by Stephen and Eliana Gifford. final number of the first half was originally written by our conductor for the Paradise High School Percussion Ensemble. Unfortunately, the ensemble was only able to rehearse it one time before the campfire broke out, and the piece has been dormant for several years. Last summer, Bob decided to rearrange this song for concert band. The title comes from the idea that the piece often changes the time signature, which represents how many beats are in the measure. Here is Time by Bob Schofield. also like to say thank you to Kathy, who's running sound and lights for tonight's performance. We appreciate her help. And for those of you who are following along at different sections in that last piece, it used 3, 4, 5, or 6 beats in each measure. And speaking of time, it's almost time for intermission. Anyway.
I wrote that joke.
You wrote that, yeah. I didn't write that, I just read it, okay? Refreshments tonight are provided by the State Theater Arts Guild stage. Cindy Daniluk, our theater manager, and her husband Dan are staffing the refreshment booth tonight, so we appreciate your patronage. We'd also like to talk a little bit about the State Theater Arts Guild, which is a non-profit organization which owns and operates this beautiful theater, which is, I believe, 97, 98 years old. And a lot has gone on in the last 7 or 8 years. As you can see, the State Theater Arts Guild has invested close to $3 million in not only our beautiful theater organ, but our magnificent marquee out in front of the building. And for those of you who are interested in live theater, you'll be happy to know that over the last year we have exceeded the number of performances that we had at the theater pre-COVID. So we've enjoyed a great deal of success, and you certainly are part of that. We appreciate it. The theater is also being recognized this month by the Art Deco Award, Art Deco Society of California, for the magnificent restoration that's been done in the lobby and with our beautiful mural on the stairway. So please consider joining the stage. Applications are available in the lobby at refreshment time, and now it's time for intermission. See you in a few minutes. Welcome back. George Smith is a retired music teacher who currently resides in Central California. He's also a sought-out composer who writes for the Gary Gilroy Music Publishing Company. After the campfire, he donated his time and talent to write a piece for the Paradise High School Band. So when the Oroville Community Concert Band began kicking around the idea of commissioning a piece for the band, George's name was immediately brought up. He agreed to write this number, properly titled City of Gold. In this piece, you will hear an opening theme followed by several sections: the Feather River, a flame, the wildflowers of Table Mountain, and finally, restoration, as we pay tribute to our community and its resilience. Our next number, Fanfare for the General, is a tribute to Chico founder John Bidwell. He was a brigadier general in the California State Militia and was one of the earliest pioneers to cross the Sierra Nevada into California. The Fanfare is an excerpt from a piece entitled Songs Beneath the Lake that traces the history of the Feather River from the Maidu tribes through the gold rush to modern times. A history that cannot be complete without honoring our iconic local hero, John Bidwell. Fanfare for the General is written in 3 short sections. After the fanfare is introduced, we hear a short requiem born of the solemn military taps until the fanfare returns to peal a final farewell. During his early days in California, Bidwell served as business manager for John Sutter, and with the profits from his mining ventures in the Middle Fork of the Feather River, he amassed more than 30,000 acres of land and built a general store, hotel, post office, and flour mill, and founded what is now known as the city of Chico. A parcel of his land was also donated as a location for the Chico State Normal School, later renamed California State University, Chico. As a member of the United States House of Representatives, he continued to help the town thrive, noted especially for introducing legislation that led to the completion of the California and Oregon Railroad through Chico in 1870. This piece was written by Ted Bell. Dr. Bell has been a member of the Oroville Community Concert Band for 9 years and is grateful for this opportunity to share his fascination with the history of the Feather River. Just a reminder about some upcoming events here at the State Theater featuring our community concert band. The annual 4th of July concert will be held the evening of July 3rd. That'll be at 7 o'clock, and then another performance on Friday, July 4th at 2 o'clock. Again, that's the 3rd of July at 7 o'clock here at the theater, and on Friday, the 4th of July at 2 o'clock. For several concerts in a row, the Oroville Community Concert Band has performed compositions or arrangements by Jeff Dixon. He's a retired educator who currently resides in Chico. Tonight's number is called Conquest and features a subtle beginning, followed by an exciting up-tempo section. Pay close attention to our timpani player as the band performs Conquest by Jeff Dixon.
She really wanted me to point her out.
player. Well, believe it or not, there were a few good things about the disco era, although I'm hard-pressed to come up with more than the one we're going to talk about. One of those things was the discovery of musician Chuck Mangione, a flugelhorn player who is best known for his #1 hit in 1977 called Feels So Good. The band has chosen to perform another lesser-known piece of his called Bellavia. This arrangement was originally written for jazz band by a musician named Fred Lewis. Local musician Dave Chalet, a former member of the band, adapted this arrangement for our concert band, thus helping us keep our local town theme intact for this evening. Please enjoy Bellavia by Chuck Mangione. One of the band's favorite composers is Robert W. Smith. 2 years ago, the band performed a piece called Swing that featured local music educator Austin King on drum set. That piece is part of an American dance trilogy, and to close out tonight's show, the band will be playing another piece from that trilogy called Square. Featuring several soloists and some old-time percussion, we hope you enjoy this number as much as the band enjoys playing it. very much for being here tonight. Again, another round of applause for our conductor and for the Oroville Community Festival. You've been treated to 3 world premiere performances tonight right here in Oroville, California. We're glad you're here. We've had a benediction for years, sending forth our audience after a performance. And at Christmas time, after doing it for about 15 years, I screwed it up. So I wrote it down. That's not a sign of age, is it? I can't remember.
How would I know?
So folks, thanks very much for being here. And remember, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Good night.